You're listening to the Second Look Podcast, where we take a closer look at what we're learning each Sunday at Connection Church to help you grow in your walk with Christ. Here are your hosts, Pastor Joe Terreri and Pastor Dan DeRochers.
Welcome to The Second Look. My name is Dan.
And I'm Joe.
And we're here talking about It's Normal, but first, hey, Joe.
Hey, Dan.
I have a question for you, as I do every day.
Yes, I'm ready.
Joe, what is the hardest job you've ever done?
Oh, easy. I was working construction for one summer. I was working stucco, and so I was actually working on this crew of guys doing stucco. And by the way, in the whole construction company, this was considered the easy job, but it was the hardest job I've ever had. And so one of the hardest things we had to do was something called rasping the wall. So in stucco, it's just styrofoam. So the first thing you do is you take the Tyvek off the house, which you shouldn't do, and then you just glue styrofoam to the wall.
And you're thinking, this house is not well built.
Yeah, this is not a well-built house. And so after you glue the styrofoam to the wall, you have to rasp it, which basically means is you take this, I don't know, something that looks, I don't even want to describe it. It's like a
No,
rectangle.
just tell us what the official word is for it.
It's a rasp.
Oh, okay.
That's what it's called. It's a rasp.
My
and you take this
apologies.
rasp, which has kind of like a rough face to it, and then you just start to kind of like do it over the styrofoam. You're trying to rough up the styrofoam.
So it's like sandpaper
Correct.
on a handle.
But here's the thing. The styrofoam, these little pellets of styrofoam go everywhere. And you're breathing it in, and it's just so gross, and it's so hard. And you're doing it over and over. And if you do it too much and the styrofoam breaks, you have to cut out the styrofoam, put a new piece in there, and then re-rasp it. And so, Dan, honestly, the first day I showed up at my construction job, I was wearing running shoes, and my boss said to me on day one, "Why are you wearing those?" And I'm like, "I don't know. These are my shoes." He goes, "You need to have boots." And I wore boots. And I'm pretty sure I stole from that company because I don't think I added a shred of value to anything that they were doing. And I didn't steal, but I just can't believe that they paid me because I was useless.
Wow. Well,
Dan, I don't know if you know this about me. I'm not a big manual labor guy.
well, I got that.
I like to take care of my yard,
Okay.
mostly.
Have you ever rasped your own house?
No, never rest my own house. But that was the worst job I ever had. Stucco, yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Well, we are talking not about hard work, but we're talking about suffering.
Yes.
Would you say that you suffered while you worked for that company? Would you say they suffered
While
you worked for that company?
They suffered. They suffered for hiring me, yes.
We're talking about the Church of Smyrna.
Yeah, not Smirnoff, yep.
That is true.
Because I think I accidentally said that in the second service.
I heard something.
I think I called it the church in Smirnoff, and I'm not a drinker, but I just and I almost made a joke, and I'm like, I don't think that's a good joke. I showed self-control.
It was,
everyone.
well, I did not, because it was right at that moment that I leaned over to Isaac Brooks and said, it sounds like he's speaking like the Swedish Chef right now.
Yes, the church in Smyrna, Delaware. Yep, keep going.
And as you referenced yesterday, it was one of only two churches in these letters that received encouragement and affirmation from Jesus.
Yes.
So they're really, doing quite well.
Yeah, they're doing well. And, I just felt so encouraged by yesterday. What an encouragement when Jesus shows up and he's like, I know your life's terrible. Don't worry. It's going to get worse. Don't be afraid. It's going to get worse. I just think it's so funny. It's so funny because we're so used to thinking about what Jesus would say to us in our tough moments.
Yeah.
And we're just expecting him to be like, let me take all the pain away. It's all going to be okay. I think sometimes we want Jesus to be our therapist, and he's our Lord.
Yeah.
And what we really see him saying to that church is it's not going to get easier, but there is a better day coming. And just the eternal perspective, and you'd well, what else would you expect from Jesus? But Jesus is really asking us to see our lives and see our church life with eternity in mind, not just our hey, tomorrow's going to be better type of approach. He's not actually deeply invested in our comfort. Maybe that's the easiest way to say it.
So why suffering, Joe? Why is suffering normal?
I've been really reflecting on that question because I don't think the text answers it. So I didn't feel a need to give an answer to that. But that's a really important question. And I would say a couple things. I would say, first and foremost, we serve a crucified Savior whose life was marked by suffering. So to follow Jesus, to me, logically, if Jesus says, follow me, if Jesus says, pick up your cross and follow me, implicit in the call to Christ is a call to suffering. And we need to be just very honest that is part of the Christian life. And do we suffer every day? No. Living in our part of the world, are we suffering like maybe some of the underground church in China is, or the underground church in Nigeria is? No. But suffering for a vast majority of people across the world following Christ is a very normal part of their life. And so I think the first reason we're called to suffering is because that is the way of Jesus. Some theologians put it this way: we are called to live the cruciform life, a cross-shaped life where we die so that others might live. Yeah. And gospel advancement and suffering almost always go together. And so we see that in the life of the apostles, we see that in the life of the early church, and we shouldn't think that because it's 2022 and we have iPhones, that doesn't mean we're exempt. And then I think the other kind of side to it, the two sides of the same coin, is we're called to follow Jesus in our suffering, but also we don't always know the purposes of our suffering. Part of our suffering is just because we live in a broken world. And that's really not more to say other than that. The world is broken. Sin is affecting our lives, and we shouldn't be shocked when Genesis 3 comes to our house. Yeah. So I think that's one of the things that for me on a personal level, it just makes sense to me. Like, I'm a super logical guy, maybe not in every area of my life, but when it comes to this stuff, I'm just like, yeah, like the world is broken. My life's going to be affected. Like, that's actually not a deep theological question for me. Like, it makes sense. And I'm not belittling anyone who that is a deep theological question. Like, those are really fair and good questions. But in my own heart and mind, I'm just like, well, it just seems like this is normal. And this is what happens when life is hard. And, it's so funny, Dan, as we've been walking through this trial with our daughter, Lucy, we've had so many folks. I've learned more about the pain people are carrying over the last 2 months than I did in the first 10 years of my ministry. Wow. The number of people coming up to me, sharing how like even yesterday, I had a few people from our church just share how they've been suffering. And so I just say that to say, like, the more you talk to people, the more you're like, yeah, suffering is normal. We're all carrying stuff. So anyway.
Is there a difference, and maybe this is the same question, but is there a difference between suffering as a human and suffering for the cause of Christ?
Yeah, I think suffering as a human is, we're all going to suffer as part of the human condition, and I would put myself in that category with what our family's walking to right now with Lucy. Like you cannot know Jesus and have a daughter with pseudoachondroplasia dysplasia. But I think the difference is how we respond to it, how we see it, and how we're asking God to redeem it and use it for his glory and good. So that's one kind of suffering. I think that's what James is getting at when he talks about all kinds of trials. So trials come in all shapes and sizes. But I think you're asking a really important question. There is a unique suffering to Christians for gospel causes that come from the persecution of the church because of the proclamation of the gospel. Like, Lucy doesn't have pseudoachondroplasia dysplasia and has to have major leg surgery because we're holding out the hope of Jesus Christ at Connection Church. Yeah. Like, if I end up in prison because of that, that would be religious suffering, or I would put it true Christian suffering. So there is a difference, and I do think that it really is. I can't remember who said this, but one person in history said, it is the blood of the martyrs that water the seeds of the growth of the church. Oh, wow. Yeah. So, and Dan, you being a missionary, you know that suffering around the world for the cause of Christ is normal. And so there is a difference between I'm sick, or I lost my job, or I'm bankrupt, and hey, I'm being put in prison, I'm being persecuted, one of our missionaries just sent us a newsletter where their apartment was being searched by the police, and where, 2 pastors who are part of their organization got questioned by the police in China for it was 11 hours they were interrogated, and they said to the Chinese police who were interrogating them about their Christian work, they said, we need to go pick up our son from school. And they said, if you don't tell us what we want to hear, you're never going to see your son again. Like, that's a different kind of suffering than I have cancer.
Yeah.
So I want to differentiate. There is a difference.
We also read another missionary newsletter this week, a couple that we support at Connection Church that live in Cambodia. And the intense spiritual hardships that they face. I mean, physical ones as well, right? Living kind of at the ends of the earth, and all of the things that are involved in living in a moist island, rural place with all kinds of bugs and Buddhist monks and just spiritual darkness everywhere. And I think there is something about the way, like you just said, the way that we respond to that suffering and how we see Jesus through the suffering, and not just maybe moaning about it, but being able to love him through it and allow him to love you through it.
Yeah. I really think suffering is one of those moments in life when we're really able to decide what our lives are actually about. That is the gift of suffering. What is my life about? Is it about getting to the 20 years when I can do what I want before I die? Yeah. Or is every moment of my life being about bringing glory to Jesus? And you really, when you're suffering, you really do have the opportunity to ask yourself, am I truly satisfied with Christ? Like, is he enough? Like, am I willing to just love him and serve him and be faithful to him through this? And I think that's really, I know it's a weird thing. Like, suffering can be a gift to our spiritual well-being. It does kind of alert us to ultimate reality. It does kind of wake us up from our slumber and it doesn't mean we don't enjoy the good things in life. I mean, Paul says to Timothy, God's given us all good things for our enjoyment. I want to make sure that that's clear. Like, when we talk about suffering, it doesn't mean we're not allowed to enjoy our lives, enjoy our family, enjoy nice trips, enjoy great food. Like, these are all gifts from God that we should just enjoy it. But when suffering does come, we shouldn't be surprised by it. And what a beautiful opportunity just to say, above all else, Jesus Christ is enough.
Yeah. Last week, I lost a good friend. He was our air director, our boss, when we were in missions for our last couple of years. We were part of the same team when we were in Missouri. And 2 years ago, he was diagnosed with liver cancer.
Wow.
And it took his life. And I was thinking about him, obviously, just with him passing away last Thursday, and he outlived his mom outlived him. And he and his wife had served in the Czech Republic since 1994 and had given their lives for the cause of Christ. And reflecting on his life in ministry and the impact that he's made worldwide, and thinking about 2 years of him suffering, earthly suffering, right? And then thinking about now his wife, who's walked with him through this and who now is entering into another phase of life as I don't know what. And I've been thinking about, Alicia and I have wept over thinking about Sherry and what does her life look like when I don't know. I don't know what happens next. I mean, so thinking about, someone who has suffered and wins their race and is given the crown of life, what would you say to someone who's then left and maybe who only half of their suffering has happened?
Yeah. Well, I think that we need to be aware that grief is like there's nothing to say that solves grief. I've talked to 3 people, Dan, over the last month who have shared with me, 2 in our church, 1 a missionary actually that I just met on Friday night. I've talked to 3 folks who have shared with me that they lost children in their 20s. Like all 3 of them had lost a son right around age 20 or 22. Wow. They were all between 2 automobile accidents and 1 kind of an illness that rapidly took their life.
Yeah.
Or suddenly took their life. And all of them still carry the ache of loss, the ache of absence. And so when you ask me what would I say, I would say, I don't think that grief goes away. It's there. You can think about it and it's back. Now, maybe it's not back with the same intensity of when they first lost. And then like for a couple of these people, they had lost their sons 20 years ago, but they're still talking about it.
Yeah.
So for our friend in the Czech Republic, Sherry, who lost her husband, I wouldn't say, I love what Rick Warren says, the deeper the grief, the fewer the words that are needed.
Yeah.
And so I don't think the words are what really solves things. I think it's the presence. I think it's acknowledging it. I think when people are grieving the loss of a loved one, I think it just takes a long time for that to kind of maybe settle. And I don't mean settle like it's okay, but you've moved to a place of acceptance and you're like, okay, they're gone. But I think when people are suffering in those kind of ways, I think what they really need is time. They need patience. They need the love of the body of Christ. They need to know that the memory of the one they have lost is not insignificant. They're not forgotten, and that you can stand with them. And I was talking to this missionary Steve on Friday night, and he was telling me he lost his son at age 22. His name was Micah, and this happened in 2020, right before COVID. And I said to him as he's describing what happened, and it was not a sensational story. It wasn't like I just said, tell me about your family. And then he goes, well, we lost a son. And I said, Steve, and I have known Steve at this point for 10 minutes.
Right.
Seriously. And I just said, Steve, I'm so sorry. And he goes, thank you so much. People don't realize that still means a lot when people say that to me. And so I don't think the words are what people need. I think they need presence. I think they need us not to solve their pain.
Yeah.
I think if I can just give one word of advice, like I don't think people mean to be insensitive when they say this, but sometimes when people are suffering, they say, it's going to be okay. Mm-hmm. And I actually think we should not say that because the truth is we don't know if it's going to be okay. Like people don't know if you're going to make it through your brain surgery for brain cancer.
Right.
Like if you look at someone who's about to go in for brain cancer surgery and say, it's going to be okay, you don't actually know that. Like you see, what we often do with people's pain is we try to tell them it's going to be okay so we don't have to deal with it anymore.
Yeah.
And that's actually more about us than it is about their pain. And so what people actually need when they're suffering is not for us to try to encourage them with platitudes and cliches, but rather to let them know we're in it with them.
Yeah,
hey,
that's good.
Hey, I'm going to be praying for you through this. Now, I think it's okay to say, I know God's going to be with you, because that's true.
Yeah.
No matter what happens, that's true. But we need to be careful about what we say to people who are suffering, and we shouldn't be afraid to speak, but we should just make sure, am I saying this because I want to feel better, or am I saying this because it's the truth they need to hear?
Right.
Because in an ultimate sense, everything's going to be okay. But between here and the crown of life, it may not be okay.
Right.
And there are some hard days. And so presence, sensitivity, prayer. I mean, Dan, when people say I'm praying for you and they mean it, there's not like a kinder thing people can say to someone.
Yeah.
And just to let people know that the memory of the one they lost is not forgotten, and that they're not forgotten.
You shared a Tim Keller quote yesterday. Suffering is unbearable if you aren't certain that God is for you and with you.
Yeah.
Would you say the inverse of that is true? Like suffering is bearable if you are certain? that God is for you and with you?
100% yes, without hesitation. Because that's really the key to suffering. It's a like your theology is so important when you're suffering. Like what your thoughts about God, what you believe about God is so important like when you're suffering. Because if you are not convinced, like if you are convinced God is with you, you can face anything. But that's not like I can face anything. It's almost like I can walk through this if I know I'm not forgotten.
Yeah.
If I know that I'm loved by the Lord and that He's with me in it. And I would just say, don't wait to develop spiritual maturity until you're suffering, because that's not going to go well. Like that's really like we can't like this is what I think why a lot of people get in trouble. They have a shallow faith, and then life hits the fan, and then it's like, oh God, where are you? It's like, wait a minute. If you wait to develop real love and real closeness with Jesus until life is hard, it's like you can't manufacture that closeness in a day. And now God can comfort you for sure. But this is why our walk with Jesus is so important on a daily basis, because we're actually, part of that is we're really asking Jesus to walk with us through we're walking with Him through all of life, no matter what comes. Because the truth is, here's what's true about everyone listening to this podcast: your hardest days are ahead of you.
Mm-hmm.
Like, just let's be real.
Yeah.
There's going to be people you lose. You could get sick. You could, like the hardest days are ahead of us. Yep. You're going to have to face your own death. Yep. So why are you going to wait until you're there to get close with Jesus?
When you could just rasp a house. Why wait until you're suffering when you could rasp a house and really get close to Jesus?
I hope I never lose this job, Dan, because I'm not going to be able to go into construction.
Just go back to Red Lobster.
Yeah.
This has been another episode of The Second Look. You can catch this sermon and much more at our website, cometoconnect.com. Have a great week.